Okay, welcome to the lecture for Research Methods, looking at the third section of Chapter 3 of the APA Manual. And this section of the manual addresses grammar and some word usage. We'll start off talking about verbs. One of the things the APA Manual Style Guide recommends is to, as much as possible, use the active voice. And it's not something where if you use the passive voice, you'll necessarily lose points. There's just a preference for the use of the active voice in choosing your verbs. And kind of give you an idea of what that looks like. For passive voice, it would be something like the materials will be reviewed by the participants, versus active voice, participants will review the materials. And one thing that using the active voice does is frequently leads to a more concise phraseology. So it takes fewer words to say things if you're using the active voice. And basically what you want to do is just put the who of who's doing the action, the subject of the sentence, at the beginning of the sentence. And if you do that, subject and then verb, you're probably going to be using active voice. Another thing to think about is make sure you're using the appropriate tense. For example, when you're writing in the introduction section, you're talking about published research. So Smith and Jones, 2004, reported, you're talking about some finding in their study. So they reported it back in 2004. That's the past, so use past tense. They're not reporting it now. They don't report it. It's not ongoing. They reported it one time. In the method section of a study that you've completed, when you're writing the manuscript after you've done it, in the method section you would use past tense. Participants completed the questionnaire. However, for this class and any other time you're writing a research proposal, nobody will have done anything yet in terms of the method, right? So you would use future tense. Participants will complete the questionnaire. So a slight difference there between a proposal and a completed manuscript from a study that's already been, where you've already gathered the data. Subject-verb agreement. So primarily this is about agreement in number. And again, the thing here is to watch out when you have these intervening phrases that they don't confuse you. So let's look at some things. A family that experiences traumatic loss, regardless of how many individuals comprise that family, is or are at risk for experiencing symptoms of depression. So you might think, okay, well, family, individuals, so individuals comprise them. So individuals must be the subject. Individuals are at risk. But no, because the individuals is in part of a phrase that's set off by commas, which is not essential to the sentence. The subject is back at the beginning, right? It's a family. Right? And so if you have a family, there's a clear subject, and then that experiences traumatic loss is another clause set up by commas. The easiest way to pick which verb to use is to eliminate all the clauses and see what's left. So what we have left is a family is at risk for experiencing symptoms of depression versus a family are at risk. And it becomes easier to see once you kind of wipe away those other intervening phrases. Whenever writing it again in the introduction section, talking about research, you see Smith et al. 2009, suggest or suggests. You might think, okay, well, Smith is one person, so it's a singular subject, but the et al. Is an abbreviation for these other names, so it should be Smith et al. Suggest, because it's a plural subject. Another thing that trips people up is sometimes foreign words. I'm not sure what that's something that a word actually is plural because it doesn't have the standard S on the end of it in English. So the most common one is data. Data is a plural word, so it's the data indicate rather than the data indicates. So to make sure you keep in mind that data is a plural word, not singular. Okay, let's look at pronouns now. A couple things about pronouns. They should agree in number with the nouns that they replace. They're taking the place of. We'll look at a couple of examples, see what you think. So, if soldiers qualify for the study, he or she will, yada yada. Now you can see the person here is trying to not use gender-biased language, but they've got the he or she refers to soldiers, and he or she, that's a singular pronoun. It's singular he or singular she, which can't be used in place of a plural noun, which the noun here is obviously soldiers. So you might think, well, how about if a soldier qualifies for the study, they will. And again, you can see how somebody might do this trying to avoid using gender-biased language, but they is a plural pronoun, and a soldier is a singular noun, so they don't match up. So the best way to do it, if you want to avoid gender-biased language, but also have noun-pronoun agreement is if soldiers qualify for the study, they will blah blah blah. And you could put if a soldier qualifies for the study, he or she will blah blah blah, and that will be fine too. Just make sure they agree. But again, if you are stumbling over the he or she, use they. But if you use they, make sure that noun that it's referring to is also plural. Okay. You should also agree in gender. And if you're talking about again something that's a person that's clearly male or clearly female, use a male or a masculine or feminine pronoun in place of that. But at the same time, remember that there is no such thing as a gender-neutral he. So when talking about a person, don't say he, unless that person is exclusively a male. It's also important that the referent be clear, so the noun that the pronoun is referring to is clear. Example of one that's not clear. If a man hits another man, he will know, yada yada. So the he in this sentence, is it referring to the first man in the sentence or the second man? It's ambiguous, so you need to reword the sentence to make it clear who you're referring to. So make sure that, again, the pronoun clearly refers to the noun that you intend it to refer to. And sometimes it's hard for you to see because you know in your mind clearly what you're talking about. So this is where having somebody else take a look at the paper will often show up these types of issues. Another thing is thinking about that pronouns can be either the object or the subject of a preposition or a verb, and which pronoun is appropriate depends on if it's the object or the subject. When it's the object of a preposition or a verb, it's whom or him or her. When it's the subject, it's who or he or she. And most of us have no problem with him and her, he or she. It's the whom and the who that we struggle with. And so one kind of thing to help you with that is just think, okay, in this sense, I'm trying to figure out should I use who or whom. Try to substitute she or her, and then whichever one fits. So if her fits, use whom. If she fits, use who. Okay? So some more stuff on pronouns. Talking about relative pronouns, and these are pronouns that link subordinate clauses to nouns. Right? So one decision you may have to make is, should I use who or that? Well, the basic rule is who for humans and that for non-humans. So, soldiers who completed the what yada yada something. So the who here is referring to soldiers. It's not soldiers that completed because soldiers are humans. And then reactions that are typically observed. So again, reactions, even though the reactions may be reactions by people, the reactions themselves are not people. So you don't use who, you use that. Okay? So who for people, that for anything that's not people. Another decision is that versus which. And here's where it gets maybe slightly more complicated. That phrases are for restrictive clauses. And this is where the pronoun refers to specific components of some group. It's just clear with an example, I think. So the results that were consistent with our hypothesis indicated something, right? So in this case, the results that, not which, that were consistent. So that indicates that only some of the results were consistent with the hypothesis. So we're talking about some restricted part of the results. Not all the results, but just some of them. When we're talking about just some of the results, it's that. If you're going to use a non-restrictive clause, for which, it would change the meaning of a sentence. So the results, which were consistent with our hypotheses, yada yada yada, now it indicates that this sentence tells you that all of the results were consistent with hypotheses. Right? So it's a different meaning depending on which word you use. And you also notice that the use of commas changes. When you have restrictive clauses, they're not typically set off by commas, but when you have non-restrictive clauses, those which clauses, those are set off from the other parts of the sentence with commas. Now I'll look at modifiers and adverbs. And modifiers can be adverbs, they can also be adjectives, but it's basically a single word or could be a phrase, a couple of words, that modify some other word or some other component of the sentence. And it's important that modifiers clearly refer to the word it's meant to modify. So one thing that can happen is you might have misplaced modifiers. And this happens is when you don't place the modifier in the right place in the sentence. Putting it as close as possible to the word it modifies decreases the likelihood of ambiguity or kind of an illogical statement. I'll give an example of an illogical, or actually more of an ambiguous sentence here. So, men who travel frequently may be more likely to commit infidelity. So, in this sentence here, it's not clear. Is it men who travel frequently may be more likely to commit infidelity? Is it something about these men who travel? Or is that men who travel frequently, is it those people who may be more likely? It's not clear which one you mean. And so you need to move the modifier closer to whichever meaning you want it to take on. Related to that would be dangling modifiers. This is when the modifier has no referent in the sentence. This is something that's just less likely to happen if you're using the active voice. So when you use the active voice, again, you have that subject at the beginning of the sentence. And frequently, dangling modifiers occur when you don't have a subject at the beginning of the sentence. So an example would be, after reviewing the latest research, the difference between the two disorders is still unclear. Okay, well, who reviewed the research? Or who's the subject of that? Because here, the only subject in the sentence is the difference. So, for this modifier, after reviewing the latest research, who did that? Well, I guess the difference reviewed the latest research, and then the difference was unclear. Okay. So that would be a dangling modifier and poorly worded. Lastly on this, adverbs. Be sure you use them appropriately. Make sure you know what the words mean that you're using. They're perfectly appropriate to use in certain places. You just don't want to overuse them. Make sure that it adds meaning to the sentence. There's kind of one thing I want to touch on. The most common mistake that I see is the use of firstly, secondly, and thirdly. Not so much firstly, but secondly and thirdly, you see a good bit. Instead of using those, just use first, second, or third. So, if you're going along and you're using that transition, you had one idea. There are three main ideas: blah blah, second, blah blah, third, blah blah. So, don't put the ly on those words. Now one that trips people up probably more than the other things we've talked about: parallel construction. This refers to those instances when you're comparing two or more things, and you need to make sure that it's clear exactly what you're saying. So one instance is one key component of having appropriate parallel construction is that all the elements of a parallelism must be present before and after the coordinating conjunction. And that may sound a little funny, but it'll be clear when I show you an example. So, men responded at high rates to the initial stimulus, but not women. And some of you go, okay, yeah, I clearly understand that. But it's not clearly written, and it leaves room to be misinterpreted. So is it that men responded at high rates to the stimulus, but men didn't respond to women? Or is it that women didn't respond at high rates to stimulus? You don't know exactly which one the author intends to indicate. So if you put both things before and after the but, so all components of parallelism before and after the but being the coordinating conjunction, men responded at high rates to the initial stimulus, but women responded at low rates to the same stimulus. So I've got a subject and verb in both of them. So men responded some way, but women responded some way. Got everything both before and after. Another thing to consider is the placement of coordinating conjunction used in pairs. Whenever you have two conjunctions, both this and that, neither this nor that, you want to put the first conjunction immediately before the first part of the parallelism, and the second conjunction immediately before the second part. An example. Participants were asked to indicate both their preference for method of instruction and their reward. So they were asked to indicate their preference for this method and indicate their reward. So what indicate the reward they want? Or is it their preference for the reward? So that, again, you don't have both before and after here, and we don't have things appropriately placed. A better wording would be participants were asked to indicate both their preference for the method of instruction and their preference for their reward. Okay. The last thing, elements in a series, which we've touched on already. Elements in a series should be in parallel form. Example of something that's not in parallel form. Children were asked to read a brief passage answer 5 questions, and drew a picture of a house. So you notice there's 3 things. So read a brief passage, answer 5 questions, drew a picture of a house. Which one of these is not like the other, right? So the drew a house, you change the tense, right? Read, answer, and drew should be draw. And the easiest way to check this is to take them kind of one at a time. So children were asked to read a brief passage. Children were asked to answer 5 questions. Children were asked to draw a picture. How can you ask somebody to draw a picture? It doesn't make sense. So again, if you break each part of the series out and put it back with the verb before the series began, it can often help you clarify whether or not you've got appropriate parallel construction or not. But again, a lot of these things, it's easier to just write your way and then go back and look for them than to kind of worry so much about making sure you don't do these things as you're going through. And as you find them in your writing and you edit, it'll become a more natural part of your writing in the future. Okay? Good luck.